Welcome everyone to another edition of the Classic Comic Archive, a series where I recap and review many of Marvel Comics' most seminal early issues. Our story for today is Daredevil 1, cover dated April of 1964. This issue marks the first appearance of Daredevil, and that of his two most prominent supporting characters, Foggy Nelson and Karen Page. The issue was written by Stan Lee, drawn by Bill Everett, and lettered by Sam Rosen. Our issue opens up with a striking splash page, teasing the coming arrival of Daredevil, the man without fear. But this panel is a bit misleading, as it shows him leaping across rooftops in broad daylight, when he more often operates within New York's dark and seedy underworld. So let's truly open this issue at Fogwell's, an old and decaying boxing gym in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Situated above its training area is a dark and dingy room, where four shady figures are playing poker, as they're killing time while waiting for the arrival of a man known as the Fixer. The four players don't reveal much about him, but it's obvious that they're afraid of him. So when they hear an unsettling creak from around the corner, they all spring up from their seats, assuming that it's the arriving Fixer. But to their surprise and confusion, it's actually Daredevil. But they've never seen him before, and assume that he's just a wacky wrestler looking for work. So they tell him to get lost, but the hero doesn't have any plans to leave, as he tells them that he's there for the Fixer. They don't take kind to this, and send in a large boxer to force him out. But the slow and heavy brawler is no match for the incredibly agile Daredevil, who manages to hoist him up and swing him across the room. Quickly dropping his tough guy act, the boxer begs to be let go, so Daredevil obliges and hurls him into the other three men. Realizing that the hero isn't just some wacky wrestler, one of the men desperately tries to reach for a nearby rifle. But Daredevil's too quick for him, and manages to swat it away with a toss from his billy club. So the men resort back to their fists, and try their best to defeat Daredevil in an all-out brawl. But it's of no use, as the hero amazingly dodges all of their attacks, whether they be punches, tackles, or tosses. And then once they're vulnerable and exhausted, he swoops in to deliver some precise, knockout blows. But how can this be possible? How can a seemingly ordinary man be so agile? Well, the answer to this question lies in a flashback, as we travel to the childhood home of a young Matt Murdock, the man who will eventually become Daredevil. But to understand how Matt became a superhero, we first have to focus on his father, Jack Murdock. When he was a young man, Jack was a renowned boxer and a loyal husband, but over the years his career waned, and his wife tragically passed away. All that he had left was his son Matt, whom he loved dearly. But he was a stern father, and wanted his son to grow up to become someone of importance. So he pressed him to be studious and disciplined, unlike himself when he was younger. So Matt studied hard, and eventually rose to the top of his class. But Matt wanted to do more than just study, he wanted to have fun, and be athletic. But his father forbade him from playing sports, or going out. The few times that he was around peers, he'd get picked on, and bullies would mockingly call him Daredevil for his seeming cowardice. One day the constant harassment got to him, and he decided that he'd had enough. But instead of lashing out, he vented his anger into a strict exercise routine, which provided an outlet for his frustration, and allowed him to focus on his studies. But while things were going great for Matt, Jack wasn't doing as well. He hadn't been able to land a fight in weeks, and was struggling financially. He kept this reality hidden from his son, and decided to turn to the Fixer for help. While he would normally never work for a criminal, he was determined to pay for Matt's college, and couldn't find any other manager willing to take him. So the Fixer agreed to set him up with some fights, but to Jack's surprise, he didn't expect him to lose on purpose. So Jack happily signed the Fixer's contract, and left happy knowing that he could send his son to college. He was in fact so excited, that he rushed straight home to tell Matt the news. But Matt wasn't home, he was walking back from a study session at the local library. That's when everything changed, as the teenager spotted a blind man walking across the street, completely oblivious to a large truck barreling towards him. So Matt selflessly rushed into the street and tackled the blind man out of the way, and while he avoided being hit by the truck, a cylinder of a radioactive liquid fell off of it and poured onto his face. This substance tragically blinded him, but left him otherwise unharmed. While Jack was devastated by the accident, Matt was surprisingly in good spirits, and didn't let his disability affect his studies or ambitions. But it did affect him in another way. Although his sight was completely gone, Matt's other senses had been elevated to superhuman levels. In fact, his once rigorous training regime became child's play, as he could now perform acrobatic feats greater than any normal athlete. But shelving this for a moment, let's return to Matt Murdock, the student, who's graduated from high school and has been accepted into state college. That's where he meets his roommate and lifelong friend Foggy Nelson. Foggy is a law student, and although he studies hard, can never seem to achieve the high marks that Matt does. So one day Foggy asks Matt how he's able to coast through school so easily. While Matt chalks it up to the studying habits that his father had instilled in him, he secretly knows that it's also because of his enhanced senses. So the issue takes a brief moment to explore just how sensitive those senses have become. In terms of his hearing, Matt can now tell if someone's entered a room just by listening to their heartbeat. In terms of smell, Matt can no longer lose a scent, and can recognize any girl from her perfume alone. In terms of his touch, Matt can now read a normal book just by running his fingers across the ink. And in terms of his taste, Matt can now tell exactly how many grains of salt are on a pretzel. And while it's true that he's completely lost his sight, he's somehow replaced it with a radar sense that enables him to maneuver around as well as a sighted person. But now that Matt's powers have been fully explained, the issue shifts focus back to Jack Murdock, who's riding high off of a series of winning fights. But what he doesn't know is that his opponents have been losing on purpose. They're all working for the Fixer, and have been building momentum towards a culminating fight, one that Jack's expected to purposefully lose. So the issue then shifts forward to the night of the fight, as Jack is preparing to box his opponent, the far younger and heavily favored Dynamite Davis. While he's already agreed to lose on purpose, Jack notices that Matt's in attendance, and not wanting to disappoint his son, decides to fight it for real. So when the match begins, he doesn't hold back, and quickly overwhelms a stunned Davis. But similarly stunned is the Fixer, who orders him to stick to the plan, and warns of dire consequences if he doesn't. But Jack ignores the Fixer, and defeats Davis in a decisive victory. Matt then catches up with his father a few minutes after the fight, and commends him for doing the seeming impossible. But not everyone's so happy for Jack, as the Fixer, feeling personally betrayed, decides to make do on his warning. So later that night, as Jack is walking home from the boxing gym, he's mercilessly gunned down by one of the Fixer's goons. Matt is of course devastated by the news of his father's death, but is prematurely forced to move on, as he's about to graduate college and begin his adult life. But at least he doesn't have to worry about finding a job, as he agrees to become Foggy's partner, at their very own law practice. To help with administrative duties, Foggy hires a young secretary named Karen Page. And although he can't truly see her, Matt falls for her at first sight. But the weight of his father's murder, which has gone unsolved, still weighs heavily on him, and he struggles to complete his work while the killer is at large. So he decides to do something about it, but had sworn to his father that he'd never become a fighter. But he realizes that he doesn't need to become a fighter, at least not as Matt Murdock. What if instead, he becomes someone else entirely? So he pulls out some old clothes, and sews together a new costume. Putting it on, he becomes Daredevil for the very first time. But if he's going to fight crime, he'll need a weapon. So what better to use than his walking cane? Except that it's just a static piece of wood, and he'll need to make some modifications. So after a few hours of tinkering, he transforms it into a lightweight, strong, and flexible all-purpose weapon. Thus he's ready to bring his father's killer to justice, but he'll have to wait until morning, as his work has taken him into the wee hours of the night. So he gets some rest, and the next morning heads out to his father's boxing gym as Matt Murdock. Once there, he hides in a dark alleyway, and changes into Daredevil. That brings us back to the present, as he's just defeated the Fixer's goons, and demands that they take him to their boss. But he's already where he needs to be, as it's then that the Fixer enters the room. He's not intimidated by Daredevil, and plainly asks him what he wants. But the hero's not in the answering mood, and instead demands to know what kind of arrangement he had with Jack Murdock. The Fixer refuses to tell him, and one of his guards then pulls out a handgun to take him out. But Daredevil senses this motion well in advance, and swats away the gun before it can be fired. The guard then tries to tackle Daredevil from behind, but the hero's senses again alert him to the danger, and he easily spins away and strikes him down. So another guard then rushes into the fray, but the Fixer stops him, and tells him that he'll handle the situation himself. But instead of trying to fight Daredevil, he simply orders one of his goons to call the police, as after all, the hero's committed numerous assaults. Being a lawyer, Daredevil knows that this defense might hold water, so he immediately hurls his cane at the telephone and knocks it out of the goon's hands. With this obstacle out of the way, Daredevil then accuses the fixer of killing Jack, or at least ordering the hitman that did. The crime boss denies this, but the hero can sense his elevated pulse rate, a telltale sign that he's lying. But he's listening so intently to the fixer's pulse that he fails to notice as one of the goons sneak up from behind and then pushes him out of a window. While a fall from this height would doom a normal person, Daredevil's able to save himself by hooking the handle of his cane onto an exterior flagpole. Then, like an acrobat, he swings himself around the pole and builds enough momentum to dive back into the gym. But before we can see any more of the hero, the issue suddenly shifts focus to Foggy Nelson, who's just arrived at Matt's apartment to see if he needs any help with their upcoming cases. But of course Matt's not there, so Foggy then heads to their office, thinking that he might have gone there to familiarize himself with the building. While he doesn't find Matt, he ends up finding Karen, who's on her day off. When he asks her why she's there, she explains that she'd just arrived in New York, and other than her apartment, doesn't have anywhere to go. Thus, out of sheer boredom, she decided to stop by and tidy up the place before their first day of work. But Foggy doesn't mind that she's there, and mentions to her that he's looking for Matt, and is worried about him wandering the streets. Karen shares the same concern, and remarks that it's a pity such a wonderful and handsome man is handicapped, and that she thinks someone ought to look after him. That last comment is rather ironic, considering that at this very moment, Matt, or should I say, Daredevil, is ushering the fixer's defeated goons out of the gym, so he can confront him and Slade, personally. But wait, who's Slade? Well, he's none other than the very hitman who killed Jack Murdoch, a fact that Daredevil has somehow discovered. Even still, he and the fixer are confident that they can get away with the murder, as after all, what evidence does Daredevil have to implicate them? Thus, while he's only bluffing, the hero claims that he'd actually been recording their entire conversation, and that they've said enough to warrant charges. Thus it seems that the two crooks have finally been outmatched, leaving them with nothing to do but run. So the fixer desperately pushes Daredevil to the ground, and while the hero's stumbling back to his feet, he and Slade rush onto the street, and manage to blend in with a large crowd. When Daredevil eventually makes it outside, he quickly changes into his civilian clothes, and like a bloodhound, follows the scent of the fixer's cigar. Its trail eventually leads him to the subway station, where the two crooks are planning to hitch a ride out of town. Of course, Daredevil can't let this happen, so he stealthily changes into his costume, and intercepts the pair before they've boarded a train. While they of course try to flee from him again, this time they opt to split up, forcing Daredevil to pursue them one at a time. So he first goes after Slade, and manages to trip him with a well-placed throw of his cane. While it'll only slow him down for a few seconds, that's all that Daredevil needs to catch up to the middle-aged and overweight fixer. Except that he won't need to take him down, as the fixer's own heart saves him the trouble. As it turns out, the crime boss has just had a heart attack, and a fatal one at that. So Daredevil shifts back to Slade, and by grabbing onto a passing train, manages to catch up to, and then tackle him. Then, as he's got the hitman pinned, Daredevil bluffs and claims that the fixer had just blamed him, and him alone, for Jack's murder. Not realizing that this is a lie, Slade confesses to his part in the crime, but at the same time, confirms that the fixer was the one who'd ordered the hit. This is exactly what Daredevil had been hoping for, as two policemen have just arrived on the scene, and have thus heard Slade's confession. So they quickly place him into custody, and whisk him away. But it's not like they can just ignore Daredevil, as they then ask him who the heck he is. So the hero tells them his name, and urges them to remember it, as they're going to be hearing it a lot from now on. With that, he rushes out of the subway, and within a few minutes, arrives at his office as Matt Murdoch. While Foggy asks him where he'd been, Matt simply tells him that he'd been on a walk, and just took longer than he'd expected. So the issue subsequently ends as Foggy accepts this excuse, and then lets Matt know that while he was gone, they'd received a call from Slade himself. But the hitman didn't even mention Daredevil, he was just hoping that they'd be his defense attorneys. Yet Foggy turned him down, as looking at the evidence against him, not even the best lawyer could develop a worthy defense. Thus it seems that Daredevil's mission was a success, and Matt's finally avenged his father. That concludes Daredevil 1, and another episode of the Classic Comic Archive. But as always, I would like to offer a brief review of this issue. Overall, I thought that this was a great story, and a masterful introduction to the character of Daredevil. In only 23 pages, it managed to craft a compelling hero, with exciting powers, and a dynamic cast of supporting characters. Only Amazing Fantasy 15, the first appearance of Spider-Man, rivals this issue in its ability to so instantly craft an iconic hero. Nearly all of what was introduced in this issue has persisted to this day, such as Daredevil's power set, his dual identity as a blind lawyer, and his focus on fighting street-level crime. But in any case, let me know what you thought of this issue and the video, and feel free to suggest other classic comics for me to cover. Thanks for watching.